to sing a song today about probably the most outrageous and famous jailbreak in the history of the world. And certainly Irish people and Irish Americans, including myself, feel that it is. The song is called the Catalpa. It's a long, complicated story, and it starts in Ireland in the 1860s when an uprising took place. Many of the participants in the uprising actually had served in the British Army and were secretly plotting to strike for Irish freedom. They were known as the Fenians, members of the Irish Fenian Brotherhood, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood more accurately. And they were captured, and over 60 of them were transported to Australia. Many others were exiled, some to England and some to America. But the most serious offenders in the eyes of the British were transported to Australia, and a number of them ended up serving life sentences in Fremantle Jail, literally at that time the edge of the earth, an impregnable fortress of a prison. And that was that. But one of the prisoners escaped with the aid of a local priest and ended up in Boston, and his name was John Boyle O'Reilly. And another of that organisation ended up in England and finally ended up in America, a man called John Devoy. And he got a letter, a very moving letter, from a man, James Wilson, who was a friend of his and one of the group that became known later as the Fremantle Six, begging him to take some action, saying that life wasn't worth living in this penal colony with hard labour and absolutely no future envisaged at all. So with John Boyle O'Reilly's help, a lot of funds were raised, and a ship was commissioned in New Bedford in New England. And a captain was engaged, a man called George Anthony. He was a retired Yankee ship's captain and not really connected to anything Irish, but became convinced that the prisoners in Australia were political prisoners and that there were human rights involved. So the Catalpa was fitted as a whaling ship and it sailed the seas for a while and became recognised. And then, in the most daring plot imaginable, it sailed off to Australia with a crew, stopping on the way in the Azores. And the whole idea was to free 6 of the Fenian prisoners. And there were Thomas Dara, Martin Hogan, Michael Harrington, Thomas Hassett, and Robert Cranston, in addition to James Wilson. And word of the potential rescue, the escape, was carried by very patriotic Irish gentlemen, a couple of them in particular, a man called John Breslin, who posed as a wealthy businessman and got the confidence of the governor of Western Australia and was taken on a tour of the prison and decided that it was indeed impregnable, and that if there was to be any escape, that the prisoners in question had to be given an outdoor detail. Well, eventually it all happened, and the ship arrived and the rescue was set for April 1876. Eventually it did take place on the 17th of April 1876, but it was a complicated venture. The prisoners arrived in Rockingham, about 20 kilometres away from Fremantle. Now, a lot of the prison brass were distracted by a big regatta going on at the time, the Perth Regatta, and that was a very festive occasion. So their sights weren't, shall we say, on the prison in that particular day, and full advantage was taken. There were complications. A small boat was obtained by George Anthony to take the Fremantle Six out to the Catalpa, which was moored outside the 3-mile limit in international waters. But word got out, and there were pursuits, in particular by a steamer called the Georgette. Now, in a strange twist of fate, The Georgette was captained by a man called Captain O'Grady, who was an acquaintance of George Anthony. I mean, even then, it was a small world, to use the phrase. And George Anthony had actually had a meal with Captain O'Grady a few days before the daring rescue. So the Georgette pursued on 2 occasions. It ran out of fuel the first time, and the Catalpa was becalmed and couldn't move because there was no wind. And it approached twice and attempted to board the Catalpa, at which point George Anthony raised the Stars and Stripes flag and said, look, if you're going to attack this ship, you're declaring war on America. And Captain O'Grady backed off after firing a shot across the bows of the Catalpa, and the escape was made. And off to the Indian Ocean they went, and then in August the 18th, that same year, they arrived to a tumultuous welcome in New York City. One of the great escapes of all time. The Catalpa first surfaces in Australian publications around 1909, but there's actually an earlier version in a publication that was a very minority publication. It's a weekly record of the Catholic Irish in Australia, published in Perth, and it was in 1903 that a song was published called The Fenian's Rescue, which is essentially the Catalpa. I first heard the song The Catalpa sung by a man called Paul Jensen from Sydney in the Vorsteiner Stuben pub in Bangkok. We used to have weekly sessions there back around 2003 and 2004, and he sang a version of the song. That's when I first heard it, but then I forgot all about it. But I got a grant from the Pew Foundation in Philadelphia to go to Canberra and look there for Irish Australian songs. And it was something I'd wanted to do for a long time anyway. So off I went to the National Library in Canberra, sleepy Canberra, and spent a week there. And I started to do research in the National Library on various songs that might have had some kind of an Irish theme, obviously songs of transportation to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, or to Australia, or the kind of work that the Irish did when they got there. A lot of it involved sheep droving and so on, and songs about the bush. But I kept coming across the name Ron Edwards. And I went to the librarian more than once and asked about Ron Edwards and the prodigious collections of songs that he obviously had been involved in his life. And I asked one question to Manny, and she said, look, why don't you contact him? And I said, he's still alive? She said, absolutely. He's well on in years. She said, he's a very, very remarkable man, and we're in touch with him all the time. And I said, why? She said, because we're always in dispute with him. Because every author in Australia is supposed to provide a free copy of their books to the National Library, and he won't do that. He wants us to pay for his books. I said, he sounds like my kind of fellow. So anyway, she gave me his telephone number, and I called him up, and I introduced myself and said that I was a folklorist and a student of Professor Kenneth Goldstein. And he said, Professor Kenneth Goldstein, he said, a lovely man. He said, why don't you come up and visit me? And I said, I will, of course. And I said, when will I come? He said, come on Monday. Now that was Friday. And I finished my stint there, and I flew from Canberra down to Sydney, and then took the 4-hour flight up to Cairns in Queensland, and landed there on a Saturday, and spent the day in a small hotel and went out to see the Great Barrier Reef. And then on Monday morning, he picked me up at his wife Anne's craft store in Cairns and drove me up to Corunda to the rainforest, and I had a wonderful day with Ron Edwards. And I learned the story, generally speaking, of his life. He'd been involved in folklore collecting, all sorts of antiquarian pursuits all his life, had founded the Ram Skull Press in Melbourne many years beforehand, and published prodigiously over 300 books and God knows how many articles. He was also an expert artist, and he painted beautifully everywhere he went. He had lithographs, and he was as famous for that as anything else. He was also an expert in mud house building, and mud houses, of course, were very common in the world. In Ireland, before the famine, most of the houses were made of wattle and clay, mud houses. And if you go to towns like Santa Fe in New Mexico, you'll see adobe houses everywhere. And adobe, of course, is a kind of mud building. And he was expert in that as well. In fact, he had a little guest house made of mud. It was a lovely, comfortable place, and that's where I was put for the night. And then I had dinner with him and Anne in the main house about 50 meters away. And it was a lovely evening, chatting about this and that, about Kenny Goldstein, of course, about folklore, about his own mission in collecting folk songs in Australia, his prodigious collection which he had amassed. And he showed me his printing press. He had actually his own printing press. Never an unpublished thought, you might say. And that's one of the reasons he was in conflict with the National Library. Some of his publications, he only published a very limited number, maybe even 10 or 20. Of his trip to New Guinea, for instance, and that would be a little book. And not too many people, I suppose, would buy that book. But I had a great night with him, and he gave me his version that he had in the big book of Australian folk songs of the Catalpa. And I treasured it. And then it was an interesting walk. We spent many hours that evening. And then he gave me a flashlight to walk the 50 meters to my mud house. And he said, now you're going to have to be careful, he said. And I said, why? He said, a lot of snakes around here, he said. And they come out at night time. He said, however, if you get a snake bite, he said, most of them you'll probably recover from you. They're not venomous snakes. He said, what you really have to look out for, he said, is the toad shit. I said, why? He said, if you slip on the toad shit and go down, the spiders will get you, and then we can't help you. Well, I tell you, it was one of the most interesting 50 meters that I ever walked in my life. I found out later he was joshing me a bit because the last person who died from a venomous spider bite had been 10 years previously, but I didn't know that on the night. So I left Ron, and he died the following year. I never saw him again, but I treasured this song, the Catalpa. And it memorializes, keeps alive the memory of this extraordinary jailbreak, the like of which had never happened before. And it links Ireland and Australia and America, Irish America, in a very unique and profound way. So I'm delighted to sing that song for you today. And I'm going to be doing it with Athena Tergis in Tuscany, Italy, John Doyle in Asheville, North Carolina, and Brenda Castles in Dublin. The Catalpa.
Come on, you screw warders and jailers, remember Perth's Regatta Day. Take care of the rest of your fenians, or the Yankees will steal them away.
A noble brave ship, the Catalpa, set out for New Bedford one day. She sailed off to Western Australia and took 6 poor Fenians away. 7 long years they had served there, and 7 long more had to stay. For defending their country, old Ireland, they were chained and transported away.
So come on, you screw warders and jailers, remember Perth Regatta Day. Take care of the rest of your fenians, or the Yankees will steal them away.
You kept them in Western Australia till their hair had begun to turn grey, till a brave whaling ship and commander came out here and stole them away. Now all the Perth boats were a-racing and making short tacks for the spot, but the Yankees sailed into Fremantle and took the best prize of the lot.
So come on, you screw warders and jailers, remember Perth Regatta Day. Take care of the rest of your fenians, or the Yankees will steal them away.
Georgette, she sailed out with guns ready, intending the Yankee to take. But she hoisted the Star-Spangled Banner and left the Georgette in their way. So remember those 6 Fenian heroes who sailed over to America, and join in the toast to the bravery of the Yankees that stole them away. So come all you screw orders and jailers, remember Perth's Regatta Day. Take care of the rest of your Fenians, or the Yankees will steal them away. Now they've landed safe in New York Harbor, and the crowd there to greet them did cry. So let's hoist up the green flag and shamrock, for old Ireland we'll fight or we'll die. So come on, you screw orders and jailers, remember Perth's Regatta Day. Take care of the rest of your Fenians, or the Yankees will steal them away. Come on, you screw orders and jailers, remember Perth's Regatta Day. Take care of the rest of your Fenians, or the Yankees will steal them away.